Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask before I begin my lecture? Any questions about anything up till this point in time? And I also want to let you all know that for those of you who've still not picked up your papers, you can pick them up today. I'm not going to bring them again. So, you know, if you haven't picked them up, be sure that you do so at the end of class today. All right. Now, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to obviously continue my discussion of a couple of the points that I had left you with for you to consider, and one of them had to do with the question of gender. We had been speaking about the abolition of sati in the territories belonging to British India by the Act of the Government of India in 1829, which is a date when sati was abolished in all territories of British India. And then from there, you know, I had very briefly suggested to you that there were a number of other considerations having to do with gender, which I wanted to raise, and so I want to finish that trajectory of thought, and then move on then to the second set of questions, which I had in my closing remarks opened up for you, and that is the emergence of nationalism in 1885 with the founding of the Indian National Congress. Let me first turn to the question of gender and suggest what are some of the other things that we need to be really thinking about. Let me offer a larger theoretical framework to begin with, and that has to do with the relationship between women and the nation. Okay, because remember that what I'd argued for you very briefly is that you know, when the British are in India, one of the reasons why the question of sati agitates them so considerably is, or why they turn their attention to sati in such detail, is not necessarily because they're interested in the welfare of women, right? And that's something that I think very clearly established in Lata Mani's piece, because what she had argued, and at least in my encapsulation of her argument, I had suggested to you that if you really have a understanding of what Lata Mani is putting forward, she's trying to suggest, looking at the whole debate on sati, that women are neither the subject of this discourse nor the object of this discourse, right? In fact, they don't really figure into this discourse at all. What this discourse tries to do is it tries to create that tradition, right, according to which then one is going to judge whether satis ought to be permitted or not, right? That is essentially the position that she had articulated. Right? So when the British get into this legislation, it's not as though they're motivated or actuated by noble intentions of trying to you know, improve the position of women in Indian society. And there may well have been some who thought of doing that, but looking at the totality of the picture, this is the conclusion that one really comes to, right? Having said this, the fundamental question remains: why is it that issues having to do with women were considered to be so important? And one of the reasons for that, as I had suggested to you, is that in the 19th century, the evaluative scale that was used, parts of that evaluative scale still exist today, right? But the evaluative scale that was then used to judge how one ranks civilizations is to look at how each civilization treats its women. Right? That's the argument that had been put forward to you. Right? Another framework, which is the one that I want to offer today, and it's obviously related to that particular framework, has to do with the question of what is the relationship between women and the nation. Why is it, all right? Why is it that women are considered to be the embodiment of the nation? Right? That's because it seems to me that this is a critical aspect of how a nation conceptualizes itself. Now, it may well be the case that in every country that women, you know, have fewer privileges and rights than do men, right? And that even in formal democracies where in principle women have the same rights as men, that in actual practice we may find that women do not have the same privileges that men have, right? Notwithstanding that, it is very clear that every civilization in principle valorizes the idea of the feminine, right? The idea that women are custodians of a nation's culture, right? That culture passes down principally through women. right? Because women are the force for nurturing. And that's one of the reasons why, I mean, it doesn't have to do simply with the conception of, physical strength, because certainly if you look at modern militaries, you don't really need much physical strength. I mean, most of the so-called fighting is now done by remote control, if I may put it this way. Right? I mean, if you look, for example, yes, there is hand-to-hand combat, so forth and so on. But if you look at the last 15 years, at the major campaigns that have been conducted, many of these have been aerial campaigns. And particularly when you get to things like drone warfare and so forth and so on, physical strength has nothing to do with it whatsoever. But nonetheless, there is a huge reluctance on the part of most militaries to actually include women. Right? And one of the reasons for that, and we're not going to do a full-blown analysis of, what is it that precludes militaries from inducting women. But one of the reasons for that has to do with this idea that women are in fact the embodiment of a nation. They are people who in fact actually give the nation its essential features, okay? Its essential cultural features, so forth and so on. So this is a question that is going to be quite important for Indian nationalists. Now, why is it going to be important for Indian nationalists in the second half of the 19th century? Because if you're an Indian nationalist, there is one question that is constantly bugging you, irritating you, if you're an Indian nationalist in the 19th century. And that question is, why did we as a people become enslaved to foreigners? Right? How did we get colonized? If we are such a great civilization, if our civilization goes back to remote antiquity, right? And we gave the world the idea of zero among thousands of other things, which is how some Indian nationalists are thinking, and how some, or I would say a great many modern middle-class Hindus think today, right? Then the question for the Indian nationalists is, well, why did we get colonized as a people, right? And not simply by the British, but if you were a Hindu nationalist, you were thinking, well, before we were colonized by the British, we were colonized by Muslims for 600, 700, 800 years. Right? Because remember that before the British, you had the Mughal Empire, and in North India you had the Delhi Sultanate. And then, of course, those whose historical memory goes even further back will say, well, it seems that we've been colonized from day one. For a period of time, Alexander the Great came into India, 330 BCE, roughly, and then left behind Greek garrisons, and we were ruled by the Greeks for 100, 150 years. We were ruled by the Huns, so forth and so on. Right, so the Indian nationalist in the second half of the 19th century is thinking that why is it that we've been colonized as a people, and is there anything that can be recovered from our civilization? Right? So one of the things that's going to happen in the second half of the 19th century, particularly the last quarter of the 19th century, because remember, the rebellion is subdued 1858, right? And Victoria issues a proclamation, and the proclamation is that I'm going to actually treat my Indian subjects in exactly the same fashion in which I treat my subjects back at home in Britain itself, right? And the intent is that we want to now introduce an era of peace and prosperity. Let the Indian economy, flourish, as it were. Let Indians take recourse to education, try to solve their internal problems, so forth and so on. That is the scenario that is being created in the aftermath of 1858. Right? Now, in the midst of this, moving into the decades ahead, right, some Indians are going to begin to think. So we've got two trajectories we're looking at. One is a woman question, as I'm calling it, and the other is what you might call the emergence of nationalism. All right? So in the midst of all of this, one of the things that's going to happen is that there are going to be Indians who are going to begin to say, certainly by the 1870s, that, well, if this is our country, we should have some share in administering and governing our country. And at this moment, we don't have any entitlements at all. Remember that the Indian Civil Service, which I've mentioned to you in passing on a number of occasions, the Indian Civil Service is staffed entirely by the British. Even as late as the 1880s, I mean, you really have only literally a handful of Indians taking part in the Indian Civil Service. For an Indian to even sit in the exam, he has to go to London in the first instance. So, all the conditions are conspiring against Indians being able to take part in the governing of their own country and the governance of their own country. On the other hand, you have this question, this constant, as I said, source of irritation. How are we to account for the Indian past? Right? What kind of Indian past do we want? And so what we're speaking about, let me introduce a third idiom here. What I'm talking about is the emergence of a certain kind of historical sensibility on the part of middle-class Indians. Right? That middle-class Indians are now beginning to think that what we have to do is we have to actually create an Indian history for Indians. Right? We have to take charge of our own history in some manner. All right? So these are the trajectories that you sort of need to keep in mind. And you can see how many of them are going to merge together. Let me give you one illustration before I move to a more full-blown analysis of what the woman question is really going to turn out to be in the last part of the 19th century. Okay? One of the interesting ways in which you can begin to look at this particular question, okay, is to see how the idea of the modern woman, okay, is now going to be worked into the Indian imagination. Because what's happening? Let's turn our attention for a second to Europe. And when I say Europe here, I mean broadly the West, includes England, the United States, right? Let's turn our attention broadly to the last quarter of the 19th century in Europe. One of the things that's happening there is obviously some incipient form of feminism. Some incipient form of it, I mean, all right? And some incipient form of an emergence of what you might describe as a women's movement, right? And of course, partly it's being fueled by the fact that now there are a greater number of women entering into education. Most of the major universities are still close to women, but they're obviously women's colleges. So for example, in the United States, by the last portion of the 19th century, you have a considerable number of women's colleges. All right? So part of it is being fueled by that. Partly it's being fueled by the fact that primary education is now available to girls as well in most societies in the West. All right? And so you have something like a women's movement. And of course, in the early part of the 20th century, for those of you who know the history of England, you know there's going to be what's called the suffragettes movement, as there will be in the United States as well. All right? Now the Indian nationalists who are thinking about their own women, and they're thinking about this particular formula that I've laid before you. What is this formula? That a nation is to be understood largely in feminine terms. That women are the embodiment of the nation. Okay? So to do justice to women is to do justice to the nation, so to speak. Right? That's what they're thinking about. And so, of course, you could say that some of them might have said, well, maybe we should be emulating the modern West. But there are hazards in emulating the modern West. One of the hazards in emulating the modern West is that women are getting, from the point of view of some people, out of hand. Okay? That's what it means to be modern. You know, so for example, if you wore trousers and if you were a woman, well, this was considered to be quite radical in the latter part of the 19th century. Right? I mean, this is because what it signifies is that the woman is now stepping outside her sphere. She's stepping outside her sphere. She's moving into something that you might call the public domain. The public domain. Right? So one of the concerns that Indian nationalists have is that, yes, if we accept the argument that we are to evaluate a civilization by how it treats its women, now we know that the West is beginning to, at this point, we're talking about the latter part of the 19th century, that the West is now beginning to treat its women with a certain degree of equality. So therefore, should we now emulate the West in this respect as well? And some of the nationalists are saying, no, we shouldn't, because we should also consider what are some of the hazards when women start to become too modern, right? When they become too modern. And one of the simple ways in which you judge whether a woman has become too modern, for example, is how she dresses herself. Okay? So what the nationalists are going to do principally is the following. They're going to make a distinction between what you might call the material domain and the spiritual domain of life. All right? So you can actually chart it out as a series of oppositions if you want. I mean, there are some problems in doing it this way, but just for the sake of convenience, So we're going to call these set of oppositions, and I think it'll become very clear to you exactly what I mean when I put down these series of oppositions. The inner and the outer, okay? The home and the world, okay? And you know, the left-hand side of the opposition is what you might call the feminine side. The right-hand side is the masculine side, okay? And you could continue down this series of oppositions if you wanted. I mean, there are going to be 7, 8 ways in which you can actually fundamentally define this, right? So one of them would be, one of the most critical ones here, which is the one that I started out with, would be what you would call the spiritual domain, and this is the material domain, right? So now think of the other question. Why is it that we as a people have always been colonized? So some Indian nationalists will say, we've been colonized in the material domain, but not in the spiritual domain. All right? And this is what I want to really elaborate upon here. Okay? What do I mean by that? So when Indian nationalists are beginning to think of this question, they're looking back at the Indian past. And they're saying, well, what was the nature of the Indian past? Right? Why did we colonize, etc., etc.? Right? So one argument that is now going to be put forward is that if you look back at the Indian past, one of the reasons why we were colonized is because we were an intensely spiritual people, and we did not pay enough or sufficient attention to what's happening in the material world. Right? The best illustration of that is an Indian writer who is also the person who is going to be the inaugurator in some ways of the novel. Okay, the novel as a genre of literature, because a novel as a genre of literature is an import into India as it is into the global south from the west. Okay, and you know that the novel is, of course, the preeminent genre of the middle class, right? Preeminent genre of the middle class, because the novel, even in the West, I mean, yes, there are earlier examples of novels going back to the 17th century, all right? But fundamentally, the novel is really a late 18th century form and thereafter. The people who are going to make a living as novelists, who are going to be writing what we consider to be the modern novel, going back to people like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, so forth and so on. This is all going to happen in the late 18th century. And unlike, for example, epic poetry, right, or the great epics, where you have usually figures such as kings and military heroes and so forth and so on, the novel is preeminently a form that deals with the lives of people who can be considered middle class. And it deals with their inner lives as well. It deals also with questions of bourgeois domesticity, so forth and so on. Right? Now, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is an Indian nationalist, right? And he is a person who is going to be one of the inaugurators, okay? Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, one of the inaugurators of the novel in India. He writes in Bengali, a language spoken in eastern India. Right? So Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is active in the last quarter of the 19th century. He's a novelist, he's also an essayist. And he's one of these Indian nationalists who's very much bothered by this particular question that I'd mentioned to you. And that question being, well, why did we as a group of people get colonized? Right? Is there even such a thing as India? Right? Do Bengalis and Gujaratis and Tamilians and Punjabis, did we even think of ourselves as Indians? Did we have a corporate identity by which we knew ourselves as Indians? And so one of the books that he writes, a fascinating little work, is a book called Krishna Charitra, which in English can be translated into the life of Krishna. And some of you might remotely have at least the awareness that Krishna is an Indian god. But he's a very peculiar kind of Indian god from the point of view of somebody like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Because when you're thinking of God, so let's take the examples from the Semitic faiths for a second. Right? When you're thinking of the notion of the divine, you might be thinking of Jesus Christ. If you were a Christian, if you were a Muslim, you might be thinking of the prophet. You might be thinking of Moses, so forth and so on. Right? If you were a follower of the Abrahamic faiths. Now, For Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the odd thing is that Krishna, who is one of the most beloved of the Indian gods, and of course in India everything is in the plural, right, including our gods. It is not one god, there are hundreds and thousands of gods. So Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is the most beloved of the gods, but he's a very peculiar god. Why is he a very peculiar god? Because usually God sets a moral example before you. And when I say God here, I'm of course looking at the great divine teachers who are the founders of the religion, such as Christianity and Islam and so forth and so on here. Right? Now, that is that if Krishna is something comparable to what Muhammad is in Islam, or what Christ is in Christianity, then he should be setting forth moral examples of what is righteous conduct. Right? Instead, Krishna is frankly a bit of a rogue. He's a bit of a rogue. So for example, one of his favorite activities, as a god, is that, so he lives in this place called Mathura. Okay, I mean, when I say he lives, it's not as though he's a really historical personage in the same way in which Christ and Muhammad are historical personages, right? It's absolutely impossible to determine whether there ever actually was a historical Krishna or not, right? And one of the interesting things about the Indian tradition is, of course, that they were never bothered by this problem. Was Krishna a historical person or not, in the same way in which Christ was a historical person? Okay? So one of the favorite activities of Krishna is that in Mathura, right, when the village women go for a bath in the river, right? So they go for a bath in the local river, and once they're finished with their bath, and before they plunge into the river, they take off their clothes and they put them in a little heap on the banks of the river. And while they're in the water, Krishna comes strolling along, sees this heap of clothes there, realizes that, well, this is time to have some fun, all right? And he steals these clothes, and then he goes and hides on top of a tree. So when these women are finished with their bath, these village women, and are just about to emerge from the water, they realize that, my clothes are not there, right? And then, so they're looking around frantically for their clothes before they can step out of the water, and then Krishna whistles from the top of the tree, "Come get these clothes," right? And of course the women say, "Well, we can't do that, we can't step out, we're naked," right? And Krishna says, "Well, if you want your clothes, you'll have to get them." Now remember, we're not just talking about a little village boy frolicking on the green. I mean, this is a god. This is the most beloved of the gods in India. Okay? This is the difference. Right? And there are very elaborate versions of the story, because some of the writers are going to use this as an occasion to make a theological argument. What is a theological argument? So for example, in one of the versions of this story, okay, and this scene is called Vastra Haran. Vastra Haran means the theft of the clothes. Okay? And there are thousands of poets who have written about this particular scene. So in one of the versions of this story, the continuation is that when then they enter into a big discussion with Krishna. And they say that, well, you can't offend the modesty of women. And then he says, but I'm a god. And they say, well, what difference does that make? And Krishna says to them, well, when you appear before God, you must be prepared to shed your ego completely. It's only because you have an ego that you won't come out. When you appear before God, you must appear naked. Naked metaphorically, meaning you cannot have any restraint. Surrender yourself to me completely. That's what it means to surrender yourself to God. Right? So there's a scene where a woman is about to emerge, and then, and she's just realized, then she says, no, and then tries to cover her genitals with her hands, and Krishna says, no, you can't do that. You cannot come to God with any kind of restraint. Right? So, because of course the poet in this version is trying to argue that this is all allegorical. It's all allegorical. But you see the point here. Bankim is saying, what kind of God is this? Right? And this is only one of the many antics in which he's engaged. For example, Krishna makes love to 16,000 women. Right? Well, how does one interpret that? Who are these 16,000 women? And of course, if he's making love to 16,000 women, does he have time for anything else in the world? So forth and so on. Right? So Bankim says, yeah, look, Hinduism is a chaotic faith, right? It's chaotic, anarchic, and it cannot be an example to others. What we need to do is we need to produce a faith or a conception of our faith that is much more akin. He's not going to say that. I mean, I'm interpreting much more akin to a Semitic faith, an Abrahamic faith, right? A faith that has a conception of a historical founder, certain set of teachings which are absolutely explicit, so forth and so on. Now you see how all of these questions are coming together, because what is Bankim really doing here, right? He is suggesting, I haven't given you the second step of the argument, and this is where the second step of the argument really becomes crucial, and then it'll all come together. Bankim is saying that there are actually two very different traditions of Krishna in India. The problem with us as a people, because remember again the original question, why did we become enslaved to foreigners? Right? Why are we so vulnerable always? And one of the reasons Bankim says we are vulnerable is because we are a people who are essentially extremely spiritual. We live in, as it were, the land of mythos. Okay? Even our gods are mythical creatures. They're not historical personages. And Bankim says, but in fact, we have two different traditions of Krishna. There is a Krishna which we have largely forgotten, which is a Krishna who is a historical kind of Krishna, according to Bankim. And this is a Krishna who is going to counsel people, his followers, to fight, to be masculine, so to speak. Okay? This is the so-called historical Krishna. So there is a Krishna of myth, which is a Krishna that all Hindus have accepted. Right? And this is a Krishna who has enervated us, he's weakened us, he's enfeebled us. Right? And if all you were doing were making love to 16,000 women, you would become enfeebled. Right? This is what Bankim is really saying. Right? We need to actually think about the historical Krishna who is as much a part of our tradition, and we need to, in fact, revive this historical Krishna. Right? That's what his Krishna Charitra is, the life of Krishna, a so-called biography. Of course, how do you write the biography of a god? Because Krishna is not really the historical founder of a religion, but that's what Bankim is turning him into. Right? So what is happening here are a number of things. One, the idea that if we want to, as a people, become a nation, right? And then from a nation, eventually you become a nation state, we are going to have a much sharper sense of history. Right? Because to have a sharper sense of history is also to have a sharper understanding of your past. Right? And to understand what are the choices that one makes. And we have to move away from the whole mythic apparatus of Indian civilization. That's one argument. And the second argument is that this will help us, in fact, recuperate our masculinity. Okay, so now one of the set of terms that we have to bring into the discussion, because we've been talking about women and gender, but we haven't really spoken about the politics of masculinity and femininity. And this is going to start to become really important in the last part of the 19th century. And of course, these are some of the ideas that are going to be taken up by Gandhi later on in the 20th century. Right? Because you can imagine immediately when Gandhi, what is Gandhi most well known for? He's most well known for being the principal architect of the idea of mass non-violent resistance. Non-violent. And of course, one of the criticisms that you can anticipate that was immediately put forward when Gandhi put forward some of his ideas was non-violence, that's for women, that's not for men. It cannot be reconciled with notions of masculinity. And of course, Gandhi is going to try to argue, I'm anticipating myself because we're going to look at Gandhi in much greater detail later on, that in fact, true masculinity has a fundamental relationship with the renunciation of violence. All right? But that's an argument that he's going to have to make much later on. When we go back to Bankim, what we're saying is that, okay, so I've made it two arguments. One is you make a distinction between history and myth. and try to understand the relationship between history and the nation state, the idea of the nation state. And the second here is an argument which is related to that about what is it that enfeebled us as a nation. Okay? And what enfeebled us as a nation is that we went on the path of devotion. Because this Krishna of myth is the Krishna of devotion. Right? This is essentially what Bankim is saying in works such as Krishna Charitra. Now, if you go back to the woman question, so remember what's happening over here. That the Indian nationalist is saying, well, yes, you know, we were conquered. We were conquered. But we were only conquered in the material domain. Right? So this is a different twist now. We were conquered only in the material domain, meaning that, well, we didn't really know how to put together the institutions of the state, for example. We didn't know what to do when the foreigner came with his massive army. Okay? So that's what it means to be conquered in the material domain. So the British come to India in the 18th century. They come in the 17th century, they come as traders. And the question is, well, how did the East India Company become such a dominant force? And so when the Indian nationalist says we were conquered in the material domain, it means, among other things, that as an illustration, one of the reasons we were conquered was because the Englishman was much more conniving. He knew how to forge a system of alliances. You break up the ranks of the Indians. You become friendly with some, set Indians against others. Right? This is what the material domain means. It means the domain of politics, realpolitik. Right? Now the Indian nationalist in the 19th century is saying, but in the spiritual domain, we were never conquered. We were never conquered in the spiritual domain at all. And of course, the spiritual domain is to some degree synonymous with the domain of women. That our women are, in fact, the true, pure embodiments of the nation. However, we realize that there are some shortcomings in our women because our women are not sufficiently modern. Right? They're not sufficiently modern. And this is where the risk is. You want them to become somewhat modern, but the problem is that once you have gone down that road, what if they become too modern? Right? This is the problem with respect to the question of women. How are you going to negotiate this space of freedom for women? And that's what the Indian nationalists are really thinking about in the last part of the 19th century going into the 20th century. And in the early part of the 20th century, many of the Indian nationalists are going to say, well, what we need to do is we need to resolve this question, this woman question. What does it mean to resolve the woman question? What it means fundamentally in this sense, in the sense in which I'm arguing it, what it means fundamentally is that at this point, we have to put certain issues, such as issues having to do with social reform, with women's rights, with women's emancipation, we have to put these issues on the back burner. Why do we have to put them on the back burner? We have to put them on the back burner because they are fundamentally a distraction from the larger political struggle. So in the 20th century, okay, essentially Indian nationalist opinion is going to be divided. And it's going to be divided between people like Gandhi and his followers who are going to argue that it is not sufficient to try to achieve the political emancipation of India from colonial rule because there are far too many oppressions within Indian society. And we have to address these oppressions simultaneously. Okay? That it is not enough to say that we want independence from colonial rule because will this be independence for Indian women? If they are still being oppressed by their own men, how is it independence for them? Right? That political rights, social rights, economic rights, cultural rights, these must all take place simultaneously. There is another school of thought, which is in some ways the predominant school of thought, which argues that internal differences amongst Indians will have to be resolved once political emancipation from colonial rule has been achieved. Okay? Once we have achieved our independence, then we'll worry about the rights of women, the rights of Dalits, religious minorities, so forth and so on. Okay? So this is how this argument is going to move in the early 20th century. I think you had a question.
Yeah, so you grouped the spiritual aspect sort of with women. So
Yeah.
were Indian nationalists afraid that if women became too modern, that
Yeah.
somehow that would mean that their spirituality was also...
Well, what that means is that the domain of spirituality in which India has reigned supreme is going to get contaminated, right? That they're in fact actually going to, so to speak, have to surrender that domain which is preeminently their own, right? You see, it's a question that, I mean, if you look at it in some form or the other, is a question that comes before almost every nationalist movement, even today, right? That if you want certain kinds of so-called modern freedoms, because I'm saying so-called because, you know, when we'd have to do a serious investigation to what extent some of these are entirely modern freedoms or whether they have pre-modern histories, and to what extent they're even freedoms, right? We'd have to, you know, but let's just take it for granted that there's certain conception of certain modern freedoms. Now, the question that comes before many nationalist movements, right, if you look at the global south, is that, well, if we achieve these, are there certain parts of our own tradition that will be compromised? And for many, tradition is synonymous, for example, with the role of women, right? Tacitly, it's very often synonymous with how the role of women in a society is defined, right? So this is going to be the concern here. And of course there are pragmatic aspects to that concern, because some of the nationalists are concerned that if some of these issues pertaining to women come to the fore, they are going to offer a fundamental distraction from the major struggle. And what is a major struggle? The major struggle from the point of view of many of these nationalists is free yourself from the oppressiveness of British rule. That this is the first prerogative that we have. Right? The first goal we have, rather, I should say. Right? And then we're going to worry about all of the other considerations, such as, you know, how does one think about the role of women? To what extent are women really the embodiment of the nation? You know, the embodiment of culture, so forth and so on. Right? Okay, so and I'm not, you know, laying it out for you in a way where we say that we know exactly, you know, what this is leading up to, because what we're saying is there's a constellation of ideas in the late 19th century, and all of these are going to have to be played out. And so one of the ideas that I want to pick up on now is notions of masculinity and femininity. You know, so for example, one of Bankim Chandra's contemporaries is a man called Vivekananda, quite well known in the United States about 100 years ago, because some of you may be aware that in 1893 there was what was called the World Parliament of Religions. Okay, the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago. And Vivekananda arrived for this World Parliament of Religions. And he was one of a handful of people who represented Hinduism, okay, at the World Parliament of Religions. He became an extremely renowned figure at that point. I mean, if you look at the local press at that point, it becomes quite well known. Travels extensively in the United States for 2 years, becomes a part of what you might call the lecture circuit already. Okay, so he's the first Indian yogi in the United States, and of course one of the reasons why people wrote about him was because there was an element of exoticism about him. Now Vivekananda, one of the sayings that has been attributed to him is that Vivekananda says that we need more of the 3 B's, B's as in the letter B's. We need more of the 3 B's. Enough talk about spirituality, says Vivekananda, about the great Indian spirituality. What we really need are the 3 B's. Beef, biceps, biceps. Okay? You know, we need to become a more masculine culture. You know, what is all of this? You know, Krishna dilly-dallying around with, you know, these village women, you know, stealing clothes, you know, having a merry time. Enough of this nonsense, Vivekananda is really going to say, in a manner of speaking. We need more of beef. Now you might say, what on earth does he mean? Before I tell you the third B. Okay? What on earth does he mean? Well, what he means, remember Robert Orme right? Robert Orme, that essay on the effeminacy of the inhabitants of Hindustan. And one of the things that he says is that, well, you know, people whose diet is based entirely on rice, they're going to be a puny, effeminate people. This is where you have to bring in beef. You know, eating meat, red meat, this is what makes you men. Right? I'm giving it to you in a short capsule form, obviously. Right? We're not here to discuss the intricacies of whether it does or doesn't. The beef here is simply an idea around which a great many other things are going to circulate. Right? And to get a good sense of that, perhaps I might have mentioned this in one of my previous lectures, just so you have a very firm idea of what we mean when we say beef, or what Vivekananda said when he meant when he said beef. If you read the autobiography of Mahatma Gandhi, My Experiments with Truth, he mentions in the early pages when he recounts growing up in India, that when he was growing up, right, he had a Muslim friend. And this Muslim friend in the neighborhood, and he would have a number of discussions, and one of the discussions was about the question, why is it that the Englishman rules us? And so Gandhi says that this Muslim friend of him said, well, of course he's going to rule us. If all you're going to be eating is rice and lentils, what do you think is going to happen to us as a people? Now you need to start eating meat. And then Gandhi says that, you know, for the first time in his life, because he came from a strictly vegetarian family. Okay, and in fact the larger climate was really one, if I may so to speak, put it this way, was really one of vegetarianism. He came from a Vaishnava background where the notion of vegetarianism was almost sacred, if I may put it this way. Okay, Jain influence was very strong, where the idea of non-violence, and this non-violence extends, of course, to all living creatures. Right? These ideas were paramount in the culture in which he grew up. And he says that, you know, when he had this conversation with his Muslim friend, he decided that, all right, let me just try out, okay, a piece of meat. And secretly, of course, he couldn't tell that to his family. He has a piece of goat one night. And then he says he couldn't sleep all night because he heard the goat bleating, you know, okay? And of course, decided that he would never again touch meat at all. This is what Vivekananda is referring to. Beef biceps, a culture of muscularity and masculinity. And if you read narratives of what's happening in the late 19th century, you're going to find that suddenly in many Indian cities, they are going to create these athletic clubs, you know, the precursors of modern gyms. You go and, you know, lift weights and so forth and so on. Beef, biceps, and the Bhagavad Gita. That's your third B. The Bhagavad Gita. Because the Bhagavad Gita is the text which, according to Bankim, revives for us in modern times, according to Bankim, the idea of the historical Krishna. The Krishna who says, go out and fight. If you're a warrior, if that's your caste, that's your duty. Right? So Vivekananda is going to capture this, as it were, this politics of masculinity and femininity that I'm speaking about, through this expression that what we need is the three B's: beef, biceps, and the Bhagavad Gita. Now, before I close this discussion on masculinity and femininity, and there'll be moments when we are going to take up these questions again when we look at Gandhi in the last lecture or the last week certainly. Before I close this discussion, I want to put forward a number of general propositions for you to think about. The first proposition is, and this is one framework in which you can fit in the whole question of women as well. That first proposition is that before England colonized India, it had to colonize itself. Okay? What does that mean? What it means is that it had to colonize, it means two things. I mean, a great many more things as well, but fundamentally two things, and then the other arguments are going to be, you know, trajectories of that, subsets of that. Number one, it meant that it had to colonize, all right, some of its own people. And some of those own people included women. You know, if you look at, obviously, England as a colonizing power, and I know that in passing very early on in this class, I'd mentioned to you what the English had done in Ireland. You know, the English colonized the Irish as well, right? And some people have argued that the treatment handed out to the Irish was certainly no better than the treatment handed out to the Indians. Right? I mean, there are very intensive discussions that take place today, for example, about whether the great potato famine in Ireland, as a consequence of which a huge number of Irish came to the United States. Okay? Right? There's a discussion about whether the great potato famine cannot be considered a form of genocide. This is not really, simply, again, quote, a natural famine, because remember the argument that has been put forward before to you, that there is no such thing as a famine that just naturally, quote, takes place. It has to do with, for example, questions of entitlements. It has to do with who has access to food. What is the policy? Are states actually oblivious to what they're doing? Right? Deliberately oblivious. Because there are certain populations that are considered to be expendable. Right? But we don't need to move in that direction. It is sufficient for you to simply understand that there are a great many people in Great Britain who, in a manner of speaking, are being colonized. And that certainly includes the Irish, the Scots, the working class, and women. Okay? And the second way in which you can understand that particular proposition, when I say that before England colonized India, it had to colonize itself, is that there is a homology between sexual dominance and political dominance. Political dominance and sexual dominance are on the same register, so to speak. Okay? The political domination of the British in India was also an attempt to inflict a new sexual order in India. And this is something that Mohandas Gandhi in particular is going to rebel against. And I want to explain what I mean by that. And these ideas are not, let me hasten to add, not my own at all. Okay, this argument has been advanced by a number of intellectuals and scholars, and in fact, I think that the most eloquent expression of these ideas has come forward in a book called *The Intimate Enemy* by Ashish Nandi. Okay, now one of the things that he suggests is that if you look at the British in India, the British have a very clear, unambiguous idea of the sexual order, by which he means very simply that according to the British, masculinity is greater than femininity. And femininity in turn is better than androgyny. Okay? That is, people who can be considered as having both male and female qualities. That a woman should always represent certain norms of femininity and a man should always represent certain norms of masculinity. And according to the British ordering, okay, masculinity is invariably greater than femininity, and femininity in turn is greater than androgyny. And what he argues is that in fact in the Indian conception of the sexual ordering, as it were, okay, we have a very different picture. A very, very different picture indeed, where he wants to argue that androgyny is considered to be superior to both masculinity and femininity. Both superior to masculinity and femininity. Right? And he's going to have a full-blown explanation for why that might be the case. Right? Now, the importance of this is very simply that when we speak about nationalism, almost all the time we are simply thinking of a political phenomenon. In the general culture, we're thinking of a political phenomenon. We're thinking of a group of people who feel themselves to be oppressed and say, so-and-so is ruling us and happens to be a foreigner, and we'd like to eject these people out of the country. In the broadest terms, that's how most people think of the conception of nationalism. And just as the British conquest of India cannot be viewed only as a conquest in purely physical or economic terms, right? The whole burden of weeks 4 and 5 was to establish that there was a conquest of knowledge. Similarly, when we're looking at the question of nationalism, the whole burden of our discussion is to try to establish that it's not simply the physical yoke, which in fact has to be removed. That what nationalism has to contend with is entire regimes of culture and sexuality that they have to contend with. Because when the colonizer comes with certain conceptions, for example, of what is masculinity, what is femininity, right? What is the role that is appropriate for men to play in culture, in society? What is a role appropriate for women to play? And that this may not be congruent with notions of masculinity and femininity in India. Now, the whole story that I gave you of Krishna is in fact a wonderful illustration of that. Because what it demonstrates is that for a very long period of time, Hindus have been entirely comfortable with a God who does not represent a kind of a stern masculinity. Have been entirely comfortable. That has never been really a problem for that tradition. I think it's becoming a problem now, which is a long story. And that has to do with the entry of certain styles of thinking which have now, of course, become dominant, and partly because we're living in a very different age where certain ideas can now be circulated, through social media of all kinds, right? But we don't want to move really into the contemporary. We're really looking at the late 19th century moving into the early 20th century, right? And so the general proposition for you is, number one, that England had to colonize itself before it colonized its others. Okay? And proposition number two, there is a homology between sexual dominance and political dominance. And when I say, by the way, that England had to colonize itself before it colonized others, there are many other ways of understanding it beyond what I've told you. I want to give you one simple illustration, and that has to do with the fact that in a place like England, you did not seriously have to deal with the issue of dissent. Why? You shipped off your dissenters to other parts of the world. What is Australia? Australia is a penal colony. And most people imagine, well, that the only people who were sent to Australia were simply all those who were thugs and hooligans anyhow, so good riddance. What England did was it got rid of all of its bad creatures and just shipped them off. No, but what it does is it also ships off all of those who are intellectual dissenters, religious dissenters. What is the origins of the colonies on the eastern seaboard of what is going to become eventually the United States? It's religious dissenters, in part. So what England in effect did was it effectively homogenized itself, you see, over a period of 150 years. And it's of course precisely this homogenization that now in the post-World War II period, okay, through various ways, people have attempted to contest. So that's if you go to Britain today, if you go to London today, I was there recently, I go there very frequently. I went to the east to a place called Brick Lane. Some of you might have heard of it. You wouldn't know that you're in England if you go to Brick Lane, okay? Because it's a sea of people from Bangladesh, right? This post-World War II, where England for the first time is now going to start to actually lose some of its homogenization. And when these people come, it's not simply a matter of, we just have people who are now brown-skinned and black-skinned or whatever. No, they're bringing obviously different ideas of culture, cultural negotiation, cultural interaction, so forth and so on, right? And that's why, of course, you get different kinds of forms of hybrid culture that develop, right? But certainly, during the period of colonialism, what I'm arguing for you is that England, in many ways, actually homogenized itself. Okay? So these are the very broad sets of considerations you have to keep in mind as we now move into something called nationalism, right? The politics of masculinity and femininity is one set of questions, the question of history and its relationship to the nation state, the Indian understanding of history, the attempt to create an Indian history for Indians, right? And then what we're going to have to ask is, what is the relationship of all of this to what is going to become a movement, right, for liberating India from British rule? So what are the origins of that movement? In formal terms, the origins of that movement go back to what is called the Indian National Congress in 1885, the founding of the Indian National Congress. But before we get to that, just briefly look at this side of the board here, the right-hand side of the board. You remember I'd spoken to you about an organization called the Brahmo Samaj, founded by Ram Mohan Roy, the person who was the principal instigator, okay, of the idea that sati should be banned. An action undertaken by the British finally with a piece of legislation in 1829. Now there are a number of other organizations as well. Okay, so for example, there is an organization called the Arya Samaj. What is the Arya Samaj? Samaj means society. So Brahmo Samaj, so the same word at the end, the second word Samaj, Samaj means society. Okay, so Arya Samaj, Arya is related to the word Aryan. Okay, so the founder of the Arya Samaj, a man by the name of Dayanand Saraswati, okay, Dayanand Saraswati, who's actually a Gujarati, like Mohandas Gandhi, but he's going to be really active in North India, in the Punjab in particular, right? So Dayanand Saraswati is essentially going to argue for a return. I'm simplifying it greatly, but we have to do that, obviously, and with the description of all of these. He's arguing for a return to the idea of a Vedic civilization, because he believes that ancient Indian civilization, or the Vedic civilization, right, was a real model. That many of the things that today we understand as Hinduism, in fact, have no relationship to the religion that originated as a consequence of the coming of the Aryans and the creation of a Vedic age, right? So, for example, the worship of images, right? Dayanand says that this is not intrinsically a part of the Vedas and ancient Indian civilization, right? The status of women. He believes that, in fact, in the Vedic age, women were honored, that women had a very high status. And of course, many people, many of the Hindu nationalists in particular, were inclined to argue that the ideas of emancipation of women were seriously compromised in India when Islam came into India, right? That's their view. So this is an organization that he founds. Many of these organizations are what you might describe as social reform movements, but they get entangled with nationalism as well, right? Because if you are an Arya Samaji and you hold up the idea of an ancient Vedic civilization, you are offering an incipient critique of modern industrial civilization at the same time, are you not? Right? So this is what I mean when I say that a movement that can be viewed as a social reform movement, that it may have entanglements with nationalism. The Ramakrishna movement, I'm just using that as a convenient phrase, because really we cannot speak of a Ramakrishna movement, but I'll explain to you very briefly what this is. So Ramakrishna is an Indian saint. Second half of the 19th century, if you ever come into my office, you'll see a portrait of him in my office here in Bunch Hall. Okay? Extraordinary character. Why? He's completely illiterate, by the way. Okay? Completely illiterate, but he has a large following. And this is a matter of great surprise, astonishment to many who are his contemporaries, because many of his followers are educated Bengali men. Right? Exactly the same class of men whose rise I have been talking about intermittently. That when colonial rule gets firmly established, and keep in mind what Macaulay says, you need a new class of Indians who are going to be interpreters, who are going to be middlemen between the English and the Indians, who are going to be the people who are going to staff the government and company offices at the lowest levels. The Bengali babus, as they're called, the clerks. Right? Now this is, okay, the following that he has, highly educated, for those times, highly educated Bengali men who are absolutely mesmerized by this man who sits there, who's completely illiterate and begins to speak about what is the nature of the divine, what is the nature of the human, what is the relationship of the human to the divine. And why do I bring him in? I bring him in partly because he is a conundrum. You see, he's precisely the kind of person that you might say that Vivekananda would have rebelled against. But in fact, Vivekananda was his most intimate disciple. And so this is where you begin to, Vivekananda is a guy, right, who said the 3 B's, beef, biceps, and the Bhagavad Gita. Right? Vivekananda is his most intimate disciple, the most well-known disciple that he has. And Vivekananda wants to usher in a period of what you might call young India. Okay? A young India. You know, he is the one who's going to try to energize Indian men by saying that we have to embrace certain aspects of modernity and yet keep to our traditions. And you might say that, well, you know, Ramakrishna must have been an enormous conundrum to him. No, because, of course, when you begin to look at these characters in great detail, you realize that Vivekananda may possibly have been repressing certain aspects of his own sight, of his own self, in order to project himself as a person who believed in the beef, biceps, and the Bhagavad Gita. And the fact that he is in fact a disciple of Ramakrishna is really quite critical. But what's going to happen is that Ramakrishna is going to acquire a very large following, and Vivekananda is going to go out as his most well-known disciple and eventually is going to form a society. So this whole movement, by the way, is known as the Vedanta. You know, if you look, even in Los Angeles, there's a Vedanta Center. Well, this all goes back to Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. Okay? What we are saying is, right, because we don't really have the time to understand, you know, these movements in enormous detail, we are saying that there is a kind of ferment taking place in Indian society, right, in the last part of the 19th century. This ferment is represented by a number of different movements. You know, in the South, you have a man who's been gravely neglected. Okay? Narayana Guru, you know, right, and very often described as a social reformer, right? He's much more than a social reformer. I mean, he's a philosopher, and he creates a fundamental transformation of the society in South India. Now, if you go to modern-day Kerala, you cannot go for 3 miles without running into a statue of Narayana Guru, for example. Okay? And so forth and so on. Then there's the Servants of India Society, which is again a social reform movement that's designed to usher in certain kinds of reforms. These reforms have to do, for example, with women's issues. What should be the minimum age of consent? Can a girl be married off at the age of 12, or does she have to give her consent? And what would be her age before she can be allowed to give her consent? And what about boys? Because it's not simply because child marriage is not simply a problem for girls, it's a problem for boys as well. Right? So there are all these debates. The age of consent bill, for example. There's a big debate about that, and this debate enters into what's called the public sphere. Right? A debate about the right of widows to remarry or not. Again, a problem that does not afflict all segments of Indian society. There are only certain castes where this problem is present. Right? But these are the kinds of issues that are going to be taken up. Issues having to do with caste reform. And you might say, what does that mean? I'll give you a very simple illustration. If you happen to be a Dalit. So Dalit is a person who belongs to the lowest stratum of Indian society. Okay? Now, you're living in a village. The only source of water in that village is one well. One well. But there are upper castes there as well. In nearly all Indian villages, the Dalit person would not have been permitted to draw water from that well. Because if he or she draws water from that well will be viewed as having been contaminated. So the Dalit woman, and very often this was work that fell on women, right? The gathering of, little sticks to be able to create a fire. Okay? Getting water, right? For purposes of washing or whatever else. This was a task that fell largely to women. If a Dalit woman could not draw water from that well, she may have had to walk 10 miles to get water. That's what I mean when I speak. I could give you a whole list of issues having to do with caste reform. Right? The Servants of India Society is going to be interested in some of these issues. And there's this last organization that I mentioned here, the Satya Shodhak Samaj, founded by Jyotibai Phule. who lives from 1827 to 1890. Jyotibai Phule is a social reformer who is primarily interested in the issue of Dalit rights. The word Dalit is not used then. This is a word that's used much later on. The rights of the lower castes. Okay? Their access to education. A fundamental critique of Brahminical orthodoxy. Okay? Hindu patriarchy, etc., etc. That's what somebody like him is invested in. Right? So this is the intellectual, social, cultural ambiance at this time, when nationalism is going to start to come to the fore. So I've already spoken to you about the formal, origins of Indian nationalism. When I've said 1885, Indian National Congress, first couple of years, 70 members roughly, almost all educated in Britain, vast majority of them lawyers, right? And just as a little footnote, this is going to be true of many of the Indian nationalists. Most of the major figures of Indian nationalism would all have gotten their training in law, right, from England. And that includes Mohandas Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, right, of course Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who's going to become the founder of Pakistan, right, any number of figures that you can think of. All right. So in the early years, what does the Indian National Congress Party do? Indian National Congress, it's not really a political party at this point in time, it's an organization. What does the Indian National Congress do? As I said, it petitions the government. Right? We want to introduce certain changes. We would like to see certain changes. We would like to see changes in how the Indian civil service is run. Can Indians sit in the exam or not? Why do they have to go all the way to England to sit in an exam? Okay? They're interested in legislative changes in India. Right? They want certain transformations in the educational system. They want greater accessibility for certain classes of people, so forth and so on. That's what the Indian National Congress is going to do. And what do? As I said, they petition. So you write up a little petition, you go and see the governor or the governor general, right, or the lieutenant governor, depending on where you are. And you present the petition and, would His Excellency please consider these grievances, right? Of course, this is only going to last a very short period of time, partly because change by petition is not very persuasive. And of course the British are inclined to see this, well, this is all like a gentleman's club. We're gentlemen, they're gentlemen, why don't we just have a little cup of tea and try to sort out these matters over a cup of tea, right? So to speak. And of course, there are going to be many Indian nationalists who are going to feel that this is not really getting them anywhere at all. And of course, the notion of mass politics has yet to emerge. How do you bring in the masses? Because remember, why does this question become important at all? Because some Britishers are already getting suspicious. What is the ultimate objective of the Indian National Congress? Right? Is this going to become an organization that is now going to agitate for some kind of nationalism that will lead to a demand for, right, the relinquishment of the privileges that the British have in India? Some Britishers are going to begin to think that. So they're already going to find an argument to say, well, who do you speak for? They're going to say to the Indian National Congress, you're all lawyers, you're highly educated. What makes you think that you represent the peasant in India better than we represent the peasant in India? Right? And in some respects, you could say it's a legitimate question. Other than the fact that the Indian who comes to the British government with a petition, other than the fact that the Indian has a brown skin and that the Indian peasant also has a brown skin, what is common between the highly educated Indian who is a member of the Indian National Congress, educated in Britain, right? And so the Britishers were going to say, what makes you think that you actually speak for the people of India? So in order to make nationalism a more potent force, you're going to have to draw in a larger number of people into the movement, right? And here a little footnote, the idea of masses in politics, where does this come from for the first time? The French Revolution. fundamentally. The notion that there is something called the masses, and that the masses are in fact a possible, potent, political force, is something that goes back to the late 18th century. Now, it's not always the case that the idea of the masses continued to remain in circulation, because, of course, there was always an attempt on the part of elite politics to exclude the masses. Right? And one way to see, by the way, I mean, just giving you a little framework, because you know that I think that we should always attempt to think about the contemporary, and that means not just India, but about what's happening around the world. One way to think about the so-called Arab Spring, for example, right? And to think about global protests, because frankly, if you follow the news, right, these protests are taking place all over the world right now. For the last 4 or 5 years, it's not just in Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt, you know, okay? There have been mass demonstrations in many, many countries. And one way to understand that is to think about the fact that this is the masses coming into the public sphere again, especially when they have been excluded. Right? So now, the next phase of Indian nationalism will be when we begin to think of the entry of masses into Indian politics. All right? So 1885 to 1900 will see the emergence of some major figures. If we were doing only a course in Indian nationalism, you would certainly have to know about them. All right? But this is, since our canvas is much larger, much larger, we can't really be detained by many of these figures. One of them is very important, however, partly as a precursor, in some respects only, partly as a precursor to Mohandas Gandhi, and his name is Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, okay? So who is a Tilak? Tilak is a Maharashtrian Brahmin, and Tilak is animated by the passion to remove the British from India. You could say. In fact, the slogan, you know, when I was growing up in India, so we used to have a course, which was compulsory, by the way. It was called GK, General Knowledge. Right? You had to memorize like facts about like the whole world, frankly. You know, 100 tallest mountains in the world, 100 longest rivers, the capital of every country. I mean, you just had to cram all of this and just know it. Okay? Right? So this general knowledge was, and one of the things that you learned was you learned the slogan associated, the major slogan associated with each nationalist leader. And so this I remember from the time that I was like, I think 8 years old. Swaraj is my birthright, said Tilak. Swaraj means, okay, independence. Swaraj, crucial word, because you're going to be reading a text called Hind Swaraj, right, later on, written by Gandhi. Swaraj, self-rule, independence, okay. Swa is a Sanskrit prefix, means one's own, okay. So you can translate it as freedom if you want it, very broadly, okay, but self-rule, but then we'll have to see what self-rule means actually, okay, because it means two different things, right? So Raj means rule, and Swa means one's own. So Swaraj means, for Gandhi, not necessarily for Tilak to the same degree, but for Gandhi it meant, number one, rule over oneself. That before I can enter into politics as a human being, I must rule over my baser instincts, because as humans we all have some baser instincts. You know, we all at some point succumb to things like greed, deceit, dishonesty. At some point or the other, those are the baser instincts within us. So I have to learn how to govern myself. That's one meaning of Swaraj. And that alone will give me the right to then enter into politics. And the second meaning is independence from one's own rule, means as an Indian, I must be able to rule my country. I don't want a foreigner to rule my country for myself. So what is the slogan that is associated with Tilak? I'll just repeat it, and then we'll end for today. Swaraj is my birthright. Right? Freedom is my birthright. It's not for the British to give it to me. It is my birthright. So we're going to start the next lecture with Tilak very briefly, and then move on to mass politics and nationalism, and eventually from there to Gandhi.